At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches Episode 7. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 1. 18 Josh September 11, 1946. Before school, Josh missed the bus. An hour prior, his mother woke him from his deep slumber. Josh groaned, knowing exactly what words would be spouting from Susan's mouth. "Josh, time for our morning drills." He groggily jumped out of his bed, the mattress creaking as his weight shifted. Judith wasn't awake yet, so there was no breakfast on the table. Josh sighed, his stomach rumbling. Susan passed him a water bottle and together they stepped outside to run laps around the neighborhood. He was exhausted by the time he reached the bus. Unfortunately, by then the bus had left. He was late again. This constant cycle of waking up with sore muscles from yesterday, eating no breakfast, running numerous laps alongside Susan, reaching the bus stop, Susan turning around without a goodbye, realizing he had been waiting for a bus that wasn't going to arrive, and then bolting towards school with hopes he will make it to homeroom on time, truly exhausted Josh. Josh bent down to his knees and gulped from his water bottle, trying to catch his breath. His lungs felt like they would burst and his rasping throat was as parched as a dead lizard in the desert sun. He gulped down more water, but he soon realized there was not enough water in the world to quench his thirst. Josh sighed with a grim expression plastered on his face as he grudgingly placed one foot in front of the other, and began running to school. Unfortunately, his house was in the poor neighborhood of Willesden, near the edge of town. So he had to run to the center of town, where the only high school in the entire area was situated. Josh was already quite exhausted after his tough morning drills, so today he decided to run to school with ease. "I don't care if I'm late today. It's not like I have football practice in the mornings." Soon after what felt like 1,000 years of jogging, Josh arrived at school, his heart throbbing in his chest so much that he could hear the tiny thumps. He pushed open the heavy gray doors and slowly trotted towards homeroom, realizing he was going to get a late slip no matter what time he arrived. Before Josh turned the corner, he bumped into Coach McGurty. "Oh, sorry about that, Coach," he mumbled, giving her a weak smile as he forced himself to slow his heavy pants. McGurty rolled her eyes at him. "I was just about to enter your homeroom and get you and the others." Josh gave her a strange look, asking her why. She sighed as if she was disappointed Josh couldn't fit the pieces with the little information she gave him. "I'm calling an urgent morning practice. Homecoming is at the end of this month, and I need my football boys to be in excellent shape," she explained. "From now on, we're having practices before and after school." Josh nodded his head as he groaned internally. His sore legs felt like they were going to collapse any minute if he didn't sit down soon. Although to his dismay, he had to play football with no food in his belly. "Would you like me to save you some time and call my teammates for you? Most of them are in my homeroom," Josh offered, desperate for a chance to sit down at his desk for just a split second. McGurty shook her head. "No, I'll do it. I don't mind visiting Mr. Stevenson now and then," she muttered, and to Josh's utter horror, a light pink blush dusted her cheeks. "Oh, okay," Josh managed to croak. As Josh led her to his homeroom, he took this opportunity to ask her a question that's been bugging his mind. "So, Coach, I was wondering when the announcement for the recipient of the Willesden football scholarship is going to occur." McGurty cackled like a witch. "You're aiming for that award, huh?" she gruffly scoffed. Josh nodded his head, unsure of what McGurty was going to say next. Josh, it will be announced by the end of September, during homecoming." She turned to look at Josh and grinned. "I wouldn't be too worried if I were you." Josh gave her a confused glimpse. "What do you mean?" "That scholarship is on the top of my worries list," he pointed out, raising an eyebrow. McGurty shook her head. "I'm not supposed to tell you this, but you have a high chance of receiving the scholarship." Josh stared at her in shock. Before he could say anything or react, McGurty pushed open the doors of room 110 and gave him an unusual friendly smile before turning to talk to Mr. Stevenson. Josh leaned back and let the happiness soak right into his bones. He wanted the feeling to still be there when he was old. He closed his eyes and savored the moment. For the first time in forever his body and mind relaxed. At that moment there were no expectations upon him. No harsh drills and no schedules to meet. He was technically in, he'd made it, he was a winner. My mothers will love this, he thought as his sore muscles eased. It was as if a heavy boulder had been lifted from his shoulders and his back wasn't lying down on pins and needles anymore. By the time Mr. Stevenson allowed the football boys to leave class and go to practice, Josh was practically jumping on his feet, an energetic grin on his face. The tiredness he was feeling all week evaporated and the dark bags under his eyes seemed to match his bright complexion for once. Josh turned to glance over his shoulder and look at Ronald. I'll always be in the first place, he confidently assured himself. Later the bell rang, signaling the end of the first hour. Josh trotted with his teammates down the halls, their muddy sneakers squeaking against the floor with each elated step. As the rowdy boys entered the change room, Josh felt his teammates slap his back. Killer diller work out there, Captain, Ryan hollered, and the boys hooped alongside him. Josh laughed and ripped off his red shoulder pads. As the boys chatted amongst themselves, Josh couldn't stop a wide grin from forming on his face. Today's football practice was the best one he had so far. It wasn't about the fact that practice went well today, because he always played with his best foot forward. However, during every other practice, the only thing consuming his mind was to show off his skills so he could receive the scholarship. It felt nice to play football without having worries like that on his mind. He had forgotten how much he used to enjoy the sport. The feeling didn't last long when he felt a tap on his shoulder. Josh turned around and to his surprise, Olivia was standing in front of him, with her arms sorrowfully crossed. Truthfully, it took him a second to recognize that the girl standing in front of him was Olivia since her appearance was drastically different from what it usually is. She wore a cream-white cardigan, which triggered unwanted memories in Josh of her ranting on and on about how she hated cardigans. The denim jeans she was wearing covered her legs and went past her black 1-inch heels. Not only that, but she also had no makeup and her hair wasn't curled. It was tied back into a low ponytail. Josh instantly knew something was wrong. Olivia? He asked, his eyes narrowed into slits. He was slightly irritated about the fact that she stepped into the boys' change room with no shame. A sour taste suddenly entered his mouth and he truly didn't care what Olivia's new dramatic problem was. What the hell are you doing here? He asked through gritted teeth, embarrassed that Olivia was seeing him shirtless. If Olivia were her usual self today, he knew she would be gawking all over him and making him look like a twangy boy in front of his teammates. Stanley whistled. Josh, your girlfriend came to see you naked. He hooted with his thick British accent, and the boys around him laughed. Joshy, she whispered, her eyes sullen and a shadow cast over her face. Before Josh could say anything, she hugged him. I need to talk to you. Can I walk with you to your next class? She softly asked, pressing herself against his bare chest. Josh lifted his hands and grimaced, wishing he was anywhere but here. What made things worse was Josh could tell Ronald's eyes were on them from across the room. Joshy, Ryan barked, jumping off of the change room bleachers. Joshy, Joshy, Joshy. He chanted as everyone joined him with roaring laughter. Josh gritted his teeth and his sea-green eyes narrowed. Being teased by his teammates aggravated him, as he would rather be praised by them. Olivia, he bitterly spat, pushing her off of him. Leave. Now, he ordered fiercely. Olivia looked up at him and whimpered, tears brimming her eyes. Please, Joshy. This is important, go. He exploded, interrupting the chants occurring in the background. The room was suddenly filled with cold silence as his teammates exchanged stunned glances. They were used to Josh scolding them for foul plays, but they had never seen him this serious, especially to his girlfriend. Olivia gave him a taken-aback look, her eyes wide with shock. Silently, the pearl-shaped tears rolled down her cheeks from her wide luminous eyes, leaving a line of streaks across her cheek. There was a tremor in her hands as she gazed at Josh with sudden poison in her eyes, although Josh felt no remorse. The silence that filled the room was excruciating for Josh, and the only thing on his mind was wondering what his friends are thinking. She clutched the handles of her brown handbag and ripped it off the sleeve of her arm. The bag dropped to the floor. The slap was as loud as a clap and stung his face. It had been an open-handed smack and it had left a red welt behind. Just below his eye was a small cut where Olivia's ring had caught him. Josh staggered backwards with shock and clutched his face, his eyes watering. What the hell was that for? He shouted, already feeling his teammates' admiration for him crumbling bit by bit. He could even sense the ridiculing comments circling their moronic brains. Olivia huffed and bent down to pick her bag. "We're so over, Josh," she yelled, her brown eyes fuming. She swiftly turned and strutted out the door, without glancing back once. Josh watched her leave with a shocked expression, and his heart dropped to the floor. He didn't like Olivia as a girlfriend, but he needed her to cover up his lie about being as rich as she is. The boys in the locker room suddenly hooted. "Oh, Joshy got slapped by a dame. Joshy, Joshy," the boys roared. They continued guffawing and thriving off of their captain's humiliation. Josh's knuckles turned white since he was clenching them for too long, and his reddened right cheek continued to sting. His eyes were narrowed and showed off his rigid emotions. He hastily turned around and put on his shirt, desperate to leave this place. While he slung his backpack over his shoulder, he caught Ronald cheering with the boys. Burning rage hissed through his body like deathly poison. It was like a volcano erupting, fury sweeping off him like ferocious waves. He was furious. Furious at Olivia for walking into the change rooms and making him look like a fool in front of his teammates. Furious at Ronald for acting all buddy-buddy with his friends. Furious that his teammates weren't praising him constantly. Furious at Susan for forcing him to do morning and evening drills every day. Furious at Judith for not caring enough to at least make him breakfast. Furious that his only way out of this never-ending hell is to physically receive the damn scholarship. Furious that football wasn't what he wanted it to be. During lunch, Josh met up with the others in the middle of the hallway. He wanted to be excited about today since Jimmy said he had a way of testing the school. However, due to a sudden breakup, he wasn't feeling as convinced about solving the mystery as usual. Save it, fatheads. We all know it's Utah. Let's just blame him and call it a day. Josh grumbled with his hands in his pockets as he stood in a slouched position. I mean, how can one not suspect him? He's Chinese, for crying out loud. Utah glared at him with furious eyes. "Damn you, Josh," he yelled with annoyance. "Damn you all," he added, looking around the group. "I can't believe I thought we were friends." Josh silently agreed with that last comment. For a moment yesterday, it seemed they were all getting along and making progress with their mystery. It was smart of Carter to add Jimmy to their group since he contributed a lot. However, that shifted once Jimmy accused Utah. Now it seemed as if their entire group was in shambles, and they were back to square one. Josh personally agreed with Utah being the one, however. He did understand that they should first confirm whether the school has something to do with the paranormal activity. "Calm down. First, we have to prove whether or not it's the school. As I said, the chances are 50-50, Jimmy said, in his snarky country accent that irritated Josh a lot more than usual today. Jimmy even spoke the exact words Josh was thinking, and it took a lot of self-resistance for him not to knock the stupid glasses off his face. Carter nodded. "Okay, what's the game plan, Jimmy?" he asked in that stupid, stern and demanding voice that always annoyed Josh. Jimmy looked around the group to make sure everyone was listening. "I thought about it a lot last night, and I realized something about your paranormal experiences. They seem to occur when you're in a vulnerable moment. The range of vulnerability shifts, but it happens anyway," he began, his nose twitching. Jessica wasn't paying attention to her surroundings when the zombie girl appeared yesterday. Olivia was in the detention closet, alone and in a weak position. Carter was only focused on swimming when the thing occurred. "The same thing for Barbara, Josh and Ronald," Jimmy explained, adjusting his suspenders. "So, your task today is to separate into partners and spend the lunch period acting as weak as you can. Each of you will be located in different places around the school. One partner should distract themselves, while the other watches to confirm whether or not paranormal activity occurs to them by analyzing their behavior." "How will we know that it's the school causing it?" Ronald asked, furrowing his eyebrows in confusion. "After lunch is over, we'll regroup here. Then, if more than one person experienced it, we know it's not the school. This is because we're all in different places, and according to my logic, the paranormal activity occurs to one person at a time. Therefore, if only one person out of this entire group experienced it, we know it's most likely the school," Jimmy answered. For further confirmation, Yuta will not participate in this test. He'll stay here. This will end up proving whether or not he's innocent because he won't be near any of ya. If nothing happens and no one experiences anything, it's likely Yuta. If something happens, we know it's not him because he's too far away to do anything. I'll stay here with him to keep an eye on him, Jimmy added. Josh could tell Carter wanted to protest, but for some reason he gave in. He was glad that he did because Josh was desperately hoping that nothing would happen so Yuta could be confirmed to be the one, and then this whole stupid mystery will finally be over. Plus, he wasn't feeling up to experiencing any paranormal activity, so it would be better if the mysterious boy was farther away from him. Who will our partners be? Jessica asked. Carter stepped in, wanting control over the situation like always. He stiffened himself militarily and cleared his throat. Olivia and Jessica, you two will be together. Barbara, you'll be with me. And Josh, you're with Ronald, he instructed. He looked around the group and puffed his chest out proudly with his decision. Nobody was happy with his decision. Are you kidding me? Why am I with Olivia? Jessica exclaimed, violently slapping the back of Carter's neck. What? Aren't you two glitterati best friends? I figured you would be happy with that, Carter said, rubbing his neck sheepishly. Jessica rolled her eyes. Were you not listening to anything I said yesterday? She hissed, referring to something Josh couldn't care to understand. You're such a prick, Carter. Josh chimed in, glaring at Ronald. Don't you know that I hate Ronald? Ronald didn't appear to be hurt by that comment, rather he agreed. Yeah, I would much rather be with Jimmy than him, he barked. Jimmy shot him an offended look. I'm not even participating, he retorted. Ronald nodded his head. That's exactly my point. Josh clicked his tongue and scanned the group for better options. I would much rather be with Olive. Jess. Carr. Josh trailed his voice, realizing he didn't want to be with either of them. Never mind. I hate everyone here. Carter rubbed the temples of his forehead. Just suck it up and deal with your partners. No matter what combination of pairing I'll assign, you all will have a problem with it, Carter pointed out. This paranormal situation is serious, so take it seriously. He added, his blazing white eyes staring sternly at the group. Josh sighed. Fine. Where are we going? He asked, placing his warm palm over his cool forehead. Josh and Ronald, you two go to the gym. I suppose it'll help if you have a connection to the place, Jimmy said. Barbara and Carter go to the pool room. Jessica and Olivia go to the cafeteria. Make sure to sit in a secluded spot. They nodded and headed towards their destinations, while Yuta and Jimmy stayed behind. The only two in this group without the mark, Josh thought as he glanced over his shoulder and stared at them suspiciously. As Josh and Ronald headed towards the gym, Josh sped past him, unable to stand by his side for a single second. Ronald chose to not bother him, feeling the same way. Finally, they arrived at the school gymnasium. Josh wandered towards the center and stood with his arms crossed. We often have practice outside. I wonder what it would be like playing in the gym. Ronald thought out loud, gazing up at the blinding gym lights. Josh scoffed, acting as if he couldn't be bothered by Ronald's second-rate comments. Football is meant to be played outside, dogface, he snorted, turning to face the boy. I figured you'd know at least that much. Ronald rolled his eyes. I know that, he retorted, turning to walk away. Let's just do the thing Jimmy told us to do, he said, stalking towards the change rooms. He said to act vulnerable in a secluded spot, so I suppose the change rooms will do. Josh glared at the back of Ronald's head. You can't tell me what to do, he scoffed, catching up to him and shoving him with his shoulder. When they entered the change room, Josh immediately sat down on the single bleachers that were lined against the gray walls. Scram, he ordered, crossing his legs and emitting superiority. Distract yourself. I want to see paranormal activity happen to you. Ronald scoffed at that comment and placed his hands on his hip. I noticed that you like to see me suffer, he remarked in a sardonic tone. Josh peered up at him and arched his eyebrow. What do you mean? Are you kidding me right now? Ronald asked, suddenly turning from relaxed to frustrated. You ruined my chances of getting the scholarship. Now McGurdy thinks I'm an incapable leader because you wanted to see me lose, he remarked, his voice turning into heat. You are an incapable leader, Josh began to retort, but it seemed that this time Ronald was serious. I was the best team captain Willesden saw that day you skipped. Ronald exploded. I didn't push the boys over their limits like you do. I let them play casually and we had a lot of fun without you. Ronald never argued with his fists, but his words had packed a powerful punch to Josh. Josh instantly straightened his back and stood up to face Ronald once he realized that he was picking a fight. If you let them play like that all the time, our team is not going to improve. I need to push them, Josh protested. His head inches away from Ronald as he gave him an intimidating glare. Ronald's dark brown eyes flashed with anger and Josh's intimidation did not affect him. Or do you mean you need to improve? He retaliated. Because it seems to me you don't even care about the team. All you care about is yourself. Why the hell do you even care about being captain in the first place? Josh aggressively asked. Ronald shook his head. It's not about that. It's about the scholarship. You made me look like a flub in front of McGurdy. Why would you do that to me? He questioned, giving him a sulky look, which Josh found incredibly irritating. He rolled his eyes. I already told you this last week. I need the scholarship more than you do. You don't. Ronald snapped, spouting all of his bottled hatred for Josh in one go. I'm sure you have enough lettuce in the pockets of those expensive jeans to pay for college. His eyes glared intently at Josh, rage gradually building up. Josh gritted his teeth. You have no idea what it's like to be me, he exclaimed as his heart yanked in and out of his chest. It infuriated Josh that Ronald was acting like the only person in the world who had problems. In his mind, he debated on whether or not he should tell Ronald the truth, just to point out the faults in his previous explanation. He was the only one in the school who knew about his desperation for the scholarship, but he didn't know why. Although, if Josh told him why, it would be a huge risk because Ronald would have more than he needed to know. I don't care about you, Ronald curtly replied. I care about why you always let your anger out on the people who love you. Josh stared at him strangely, not understanding what he meant. You keep pushing Olivia away when all she wants is to hang out with you for an hour. Was it fun watching her suffer? Did it fill your cup with cold malice? Don't answer. I don't give a damn what you have to say about how you make cruelty all right with twisted logic. She gave you love and you abused it, he bitterly disputed. Josh held still, staring at Ronald with his resentful eyes locked right on his. There was a wrinkle in his nose that had nothing to do with the coming sneeze. Why the hell do you care about my relationship with Olivia? He furiously asked with tightened muscles. Don't answer that, I know why. You like her and you're jealous of me, right? He remarked, unable to control his breathing. You're jealous of the fact that I'm team captain, that I'm going to get the scholarship, that I'm dating Olivia. There's no way of telling you're going to get the scholarship. The month isn't over yet, Ronald swiftly retaliated. Listen, I understand wanting to get the scholarship for the sake of achieving something, but if you genuinely don't need it because your family can pay for it themselves, leave the spots open for others who can't afford college. Make this a fair competition, Ronald said, forcing himself to calm his temper. My family can't. My family can't pay for it either. Josh shouted, clenching his eyes shut so he wouldn't see Ronald's reaction to the revelation of his lie. Ronald stared at him baffled. So now you're lying. Josh's eyes shot open quicker than a bullet being triggered by a simple press and his chest heaved heavily. Why can't he understand? He clenched his fists. Why can't he just let it go? He stepped forward. Why wasn't telling him last week about my desire for the scholarship enough? He gripped Ronald's red varsity jacket. A hard punch landed on his face. Ronald tumbled to the ground after the sudden attack. He looked up and cupped his stinging cheek. At first, he gazed up at him with a pained expression. His sullen eyes drooped and his lips parted as if he wasn't expecting Josh to do that. Then a fire burned in his dark brown eyes and scorched the world around them. Ronald reluctantly picked himself up and stared at Josh darkly. His resentment held all the power of a wildfire and Josh could practically see the flames roaring in his eyes, ready to ignite anything that he came in contact with. Josh almost regretted what he did. Almost. There was tense stillness on both sides. If hatred was visible, the air would have been scarlet with the fire that was flaming on either side. Suddenly there was movement, with so much force in every swish of the wind surrounding them. Ronald rained blows onto Josh as if he meant to smash him into the very earth, and Josh didn't hesitate to do the same. Each boy didn't just want the other dead. They wanted him smashed, obliterated, and nothing left to bury. Josh felt his fist land in Ronald's gut. The once hard bones along his body now crumpled like soft bread crumbs. Ronald staggered backwards and started to get slower. Josh got faster. In the middle of the fight, his anger faded and blankness was its replacement. Josh could see all his soft spots. Amid the punching and grunting, Josh managed to spit out a few harsh words. "I hate you," he seared, panting heavily. "We'll never understand. Never." A sudden gush of pain jolted throughout Josh's body. His stomach ached. His arms lost tension and his legs began to weaken. "There's no way I'll let Ronald get the better of me," he fiercely thought as he dropped to the ground. His tongue was soaked with the taste of bitter blood as his head clanged against the bench behind him. Bruised and winded, with a leg in agony, he swiftly grabbed Ronald's foot and jerked him to the ground. His head was pounding. He cautiously crawled on top of Ronald's fallen body as the boy beneath him groaned in pain. He brought a fist to his rival's face, snapping his nose into a misshapen mess. He beat and beat, punched and punched. He showed no mercy. It didn't dawn to him that what they were fighting over was so pointless in the grand scheme of things. Josh knew in the back of his mind that the scholarship was his, so why would he beat Ronald up for that? Perhaps because he was infatuated with Olivia, but Josh didn't care about her. It could be because he wanted to be the team captain, but Josh's position on the team was secured. Josh finally concluded that all he wanted to do was let go of all the anger that had been boiling up inside of him throughout the day. No, throughout his entire life. He wasn't angry at Ronald, or Olivia, or his teammates. It was his mother's, and it was football. His mother's football, his mother's football, his mother's football. He had swallowed that anger earlier when it was simply a fire seed. But he forgot to drink something cool, and so it grew in his belly until it came out as hot as any dragon flame. On the person Josh wanted to amend things with the most. He would never forget his eyes, how that fire burnt him to ash. He would also never forget the image of Ronald's grotesque and beat-up face. Already his eyes were swollen and bloody spit drooled from his slack jaws. He was now as revolting as he should be, Josh anxiously told himself. Ronald gagged and spit blood one last time before a stream of tears leaked down his face. He was too injured to vocally let out a cry, but water flowed from his eyes nonetheless. The water cleansed the fire that previously burnt in his eyes, and washed away the ashes that remained. Tears welled up in Josh's eyes too. It just happened and he couldn't stop it if he tried. His punches gradually slowed down and his hands were trembling. "I'm sorry." He desperately wanted to shout. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." To his dismay, the only words that escaped his mouth were and a couple of humiliating whimpers. A gut-wrenching feeling consumed his body as his heart dropped to the floor. What the hell was I thinking? The guilt sat not on his chest but inside his brain. What he had done he could not undo. He could make amends for this in subtle ways, but he knew Ronald would never forgive him. The guilt was a stain on him like an ugly scar. It reminded him of the stains on the walls of his house. Ronald groggily sat up and kicked Josh's legs off of him. "Rest. Don't stand up," he wanted to say. Once again, only chokes escaped from deep within his dry throat. Ronald distanced himself from Josh, pushing himself across the floor by using his bloody hands. Light red handprints stained the varnished floor with every touch. He leaned against the bench across from Josh. Ronald's breathing had slowed down to a concerning amount, and worry flooded Josh's vision. "Please don't die." Ronald looked up and stared at Josh blankly. "Why?" he whispered with pain. Josh sniffled as he peered at the boy in front of him, allowing him to speak. "Why do you?" His voice suddenly rose, causing Josh to flinch. "Why do you hate me? That's all I want to know. That's all I wanted to know for the past 5 years." Ronald burst, blood dripping from his flattened nose. Josh could feel the tension and hear the intensity in his tone. There were many deep emotions behind those words. Forget about everything else. Forget about the scholarship. Forget about who deserves to be team captain. Forget about Olivia. Ronald choked, tears rolling down his cheeks, leaving wet streaks across his dark skin. "Just tell me. Why do you hate me?" Josh controlled his heavy panting and wiped his bloody nose. They sat across from each other on the change room floor, staring at each other with a whirlwind of emotions. Josh couldn't muster up the strength to stand up, let alone crawl towards Ronald and profusely apologize. After another moment of icy silence, Josh realized Ronald didn't want an apology. He wanted an answer. I don't. Josh slowly began, forcing himself to swallow the lump in his throat. His body suddenly ached as he moved his mouth. The ache was dull, as if some lazy torturer was standing right behind him, only applying enough pressure to be an annoyance. Josh gulped before continuing, flinching and unflinching his eyes to soothe the pain. I don't hate you, Ronald, he said. It took a couple of confusing seconds for Josh to realize nothing had come out of his mouth. He stared at Ronald and blinked rapidly. A memory abruptly reattached within him, and he saw Ronald in a new light. Or rather, the same light as before. Josh scoffed at the thoughts he had in his head 20 seconds ago. I don't hate you. I do hate you. His green eyes flashed as the venom in his soul poured out and splattered the ground around him. He slowly trudged towards Ronald, his hands shaking as they clawed at the floor, pushing him forward. Yes, Ronald. I will forget about everything else. He halted as he approached Ronald, and stared deeply in his eyes. The green monster within him exploded, and there was no more guilt. I remember why. Why I hate you. Suddenly, Josh placed his tremoring palms on Ronald's left cheek and pinched it violently. I hate you, Ronald. I hate you because of your dirty skin. He hissed, twisting his blistered cheek. Ronald's lips parted and a small gasp escaped him. His eyes widened as he finally understood. I remember now, Josh jeered, digging his sharp fingernails into his skin as hatred flooded through his coarse veins. 5 years ago. 5 years ago, in 1941, 11-year-old Josh had rushed excitedly to the neighborhood park, juggling a football in his hand. Once he arrived at the park, he spotted his school friend, Ronald. He enthusiastically waved to him, and Ronald waved back, a huge grin on his face. Josh, think fast, Ronald exclaimed, chucking his football at him. Josh gleefully squeaked and ducked, before slamming into Ronald. Together they toppled to the ground, laughing. What was that for? Ronald asked, pushing Josh off of him and dropping him in the soil. Josh jumped back on his feet, unbothered by the dirt smeared on his clothes. Why did you bring your football? I brought mine and we only need one. He giddily exclaimed, shaking the gravel from his cropped auburn hair. The young Ronald shrugged. I thought you were going to forget like last time, he said, sticking his tongue out at him. Josh stuck his tongue back out at him. Whatever. Let's play now, he exclaimed, throwing the football in the air. The clumsy boys began to play football on the bright green field. Their version of football was to chuck the ball across the field and tackle each other now and then. They saw the high school boys doing this a couple of years ago, so they decided to copy them. Since then, football became an enjoyable pastime for both of them. They even joined the kiddies' football club at school. And they won medals for things like participation and good sportsmanship. After a while, Ronald trotted towards Josh and jokingly snatched the ball from his hand. It's getting quite dark now, Ronald commented, peering up at the purple evening sky. Josh nodded his head and stole the ball from his hands. But I don't want to go home. I want to play football with you forever, he stubbornly remarked and pouted. Ronald giggled and pinched Josh's arms. After a couple of minutes of playful hitting, Ronald stopped and looked at Josh seriously. Why don't we play football in my backyard? Though my house is quite far away from here. Josh's eyes widened at the suggestion. Yeah, my house is just down the road, so we can play there. Great. That way we can play all night, Ronald said, grinning and clapping his hands. I need to ask my mother first. I'll be back in a jiffy, Josh said, and Ronald nodded his head. Josh smiled and picked up his football from the ground. Then he turned to run across the street, his body pumping excitedly with each footfall. Once Josh reached his house, he was glad to see that Susan was sitting on the porch, fanning herself. Josh bounced up the steps and approached his mother. Mom. Susan, she curtly replied, leaning back in her wooden chair. A commanding aura always surrounded her, which caused a slight chill to travel up Josh's spine. Josh bit his lip and nodded. Susan, is it all right if I invite my friend Ronald over? Josh innocently asked, flexing his calves as he patiently waited for a response. Susan lifted the dark sunglasses that covered her face, and she peered at Josh with her narrow eyes. No one is allowed to come over, Josh. You already know that. What will your friends say when they find out you have two moms? They'll tease and bully you forever, Josh, that's what she strictly said. Josh sighed and nodded, having heard this speech a million times before. I know, Mom. I mean Susan. But Ronald and I are simply going to be playing football in the backyard. He won't even step inside. He won't see a speck, I promise. He assured her, his green eyes bright with hope. Susan clicked her tongue sharply and leaned towards Josh, realizing she had to use an alternate method. Ronald, is he that dirty one I saw you hanging out with at school? She asked in a low, scary voice, her black eyes fiercely eyeing Josh. He gave her a dumbfounded look. Ronald isn't dirty, Mom. Susan. Ronald isn't dirty, Susan. And yes, he's my buddy from my middle school. He's nice and we play football together, Josh said, giving his mother a wide grin, hoping he will be able to persuade her. Josh, Susan said, standing up from her chair. Then she kneeled to reach Josh's height and curled her bony hands around Josh's skinny arms. He shivered at the iciness of her touch, even though the summer heat was blazing. Tell me something. What is the color of Ronald's skin? He pondered for a moment. Chocolate. He giddily answered, lightly bouncing on his feet. His skin is the color of my favorite chocolate bar, Susan. I'm so jealous. I want my skin to be chocolate. Josh felt a cold hand smack his cheek. He whimpered with shock and looked up at his mother, fear lighting his watery eyes. Josh, dirty people like him are not allowed to step foot in my house, she sternly stated through gritted teeth. But I simply want to play football with him, Josh squeaked, unable to stop the tears from rolling down his stinging cheeks. Susan shook her head. Dirty people like him are bad, Josh. He may be nice now, but when he's older, he'll hurt you, Josh. He'll steal everything from you. It would be better to stop being friends with him now, as to avoid yourself from being heartbroken in the future. Does that mean I have to stop playing football with him? But Susan, he's my best buddy. Josh protested sadly. I love playing football with him. He uselessly added. Susan sighed. You're too young to understand, but you'll thank me for looking out for you when you're older. Susan placed her sunglasses back on her face as she plopped onto the chair. Now go back to the park and tell Ronald you have to eat dinner. Don't ever play football with him again and do not hang out with him at school. Do you understand, Josh? Josh solemnly nodded his head. His eyes drained of its innocence. Susan wasn't satisfied with that response. What is Ronald? She seethed, her icy breath chilling Josh's bones. Josh looked up and fumbled with his words. Dirty. He responded, unsure of what to make of this new information. Susan nodded her head. Leave. Now. He slowly trudged towards the park, clutching his football tightly against his body. When he arrived at the park, Josh saw Ronald throwing his football in the air and catching it. As much as he desperately wanted to join him, the young boy had no choice but to do what his mother said. To a young child like him, his parents are his world, and he didn't want to imagine the consequences he'll face if he didn't listen to his mother. Ronald, he whispered, trying not to choke on his words. Ronald turned around and smiled brightly. Josh, did your parents agree? He asked, bobbing his head ecstatically. Josh shook his head. Not today. I have to go home and eat dinner, he quietly lied, staring down at his red sneakers. Ronald shrugged, understanding. That's fine. How about tomorrow? Josh looked up and bit his lip. Perhaps. He doubtfully said, his green eyes drooping. The young Ronald raised an eyebrow but didn't question any further. Okay. Good night, Josh, he said, waving him goodbye and turning to walk away. Josh widened his eyes and his small heart dropped to the floor as he watched his best friend walk away. He quickly ran towards him and gave him a big hug from behind. Good night, Ronald. 19 Ronald. September 11th, 1946 lunch. Do you understand, Ronald? Ronald wiped the bloody tears that were running down his face. He blinked rapidly and stared at Josh, who was sitting in front of him. His luminous green eyes pierced into Ronald's sunken heart, causing the rips and tears that were already there to expand. A chill was in his blood, the coldness bringing the synapses of his brain to a standstill. Part of it was the painful truth that damaged him, yet the other he could endure. He could sleep through the night without the anesthesia of false hope. His mind was blank and no questions were running through his head. He finally understood. He finally understood the deep-rooted problem within Josh. He learned what happened the last day he and Josh were friends. Strangely, Ronald didn't feel anything after hearing this information. Peace used to reside within his deep brown eyes, but now that space was vacant. He didn't feel whole, he felt shattered. For most of his life, his world was joyful, with only a couple of painful moments. It would take an inside job to cause emotional injury for a resilient person like him, and Josh did just that. Now that all the loose ends of his relationship with Josh were tied, he felt ruptured and heartsick, not fulfilled. He realized that it was too optimistic to think that he would be able to retrieve his friend from the river of Styx. Ronald had previously imagined what this day would feel like. The day that Josh would tell him the truth. He thought he would feel completed and satisfied. He believed that after having this supposed peaceful conversation, their rivalry would end and they would return to playing football in the neighborhood park. In hindsight, Ronald realized that their goodnights were truly final goodbyes. You, Ronald choked, as his frigid blood drained from his body with every passing second. How could you let your mother influence you to think like that? Ronald whispered, his raspy voice causing a strain on his softened throat. He stared at the monster in front of him with a pained expression, wondering where the Josh he knew went. Are you saying that my mother was wrong? Josh snarled. Without warning, he smashed his head against Ronald's. His monstrous eyes flitted as they scanned Ronald's hematic and wounded face. Ronald faltered at the sudden force as he felt his brain rock back and forth. His vision of Josh became distorted, and he only saw the fuzzy outlines of a bloody beast. My mother is never wrong. Ronald noticed that there was something in that shout, like there was pain behind it. Ronald watched Josh's flickering green eyes. Then he knew. The anger was nothing but a shield for his anguish, like a cornered soldier randomly throwing out grenades, scared for his life and lonely. He breathed in slowly. What if nothing blew up? Wouldn't Josh have to calm down? Wouldn't the shield clatter to the ground and he had no choice but to let the pain tumble out? He observed something similar during their physical fight when Josh slowed down once he got the upper hand. It was like he was at the tip of an iceberg, ready to break at any moment and spill his true feelings. Ronald peered up at Josh with bruised eyes and saw his blistered mouth moving. It was like he wanted to say something. However, later, his mood quickly converted back to its usual ill-tempered self when he remembered what his mother told him. Ronald sucked the thick air as his head ringed, hoping the oxygen would stop him from crawling towards death. Josh. He breathed as he noticed one last string of hope dangling in front of him. Perhaps he could forgive Josh and then their friendship will be mended. Ronald reached out and grasped the string, clinging onto it like it was his lifeline. I understand that back then. You listened to your mother because as a child, your parents are your world. You would obey their requests mindlessly because you believe that they're right. His grip around the string tightened, as he desperately hoped for an end to this searing agony. I forgive you for back then. But Josh, now you're older. You should know that your mother is wrong. I will never do the things she said I would do to you. I am not dirty. Josh's eyes widened as Ronald's heart lit up. Did it work? Are we friends? Can we play football together now? That doesn't change the fact that you're dirty. My mother is never wrong. Josh growled, his eyes flashing with the rage of a serpent. Josh shoved Ronald and his back slammed against the sharp bench behind him. Ronald drowsily watched as Josh stood up and flicked his wrist to check his watch. Lunch is over. I'm going back to the group. Ronald outstretched his arms and tried calling out to Josh, but the string spiraled out of his grasp. He realized it was too late. It was too late to try and mend his friendship with Josh. Josh had already moved on from his childhood, and so should he. It was a painful ending, but it was one Ronald could handle. He and Josh would still be talking to each other at times, due to the paranormal mystery, but there would be no rivalry and no friendship. He probably will mourn for a couple of days, but after that, he will grow up. He will find new friends and find a new place for himself in the world. Perhaps this was good for Ronald. It would be like he was given a new life. All the blood loss and wounds he had forcibly concealed for the past half hour caught up to him and swiftly flooded through his body. It was like a heavy log was being lifted from a lake, and the water from the blockaded side comes rushing through to fill the vacant side. Ronald was fatigued from all the punching, arguing, and emotional distress. He was in so much pain his complexion became ashen. His natural ebony skin has sunken in a tone to something so lifeless that it scared Ronald when he scanned his own quivering hands. His eyes were wired shut as he sucks himself into a deeper place to cope. He sat still on the empty change room floor and realized how small and powerless he was against Josh. Against the entire world. He felt like the loneliest boy in the world. A dark void appeared in his heart. A never-ending dark void that consumed everything. So that he's left feeling nothing. Nothing to subside his hollow soul that creeps in the shadows, away from other human life because its emptiness is so consuming it can't bear to pretend that everything is okay. He knew Josh's hatred of him is nothing but a transformation of his shame and insecurities. It is all he hates about himself yet lacks the courage to face. Ronald knew that it was far easier for Josh to lose himself in the theatrics of his mind, casting himself as a victim than it is to swallow even an ounce of truth. All he can do is beat down a person who's already had more than their soul can take several times over. Ronald wants to help Josh find a way out of his hatred, to see him for who he really is under the ever-changing illusions conjured by Josh's mind. Ronald began weeping. His eyes drip with tears. His walls, the walls that hold him up and make him strong, just collapse. Moment by moment they fall. Salty drops fall from his chin, drenching his shirt. Perhaps these tears will help wash the blood out. Someone abruptly tapped his shoulder. Its slender fingers pressed into the skin of his forearms, sharp nails biting in the layer of fine dust, drawing beads of blood. Ronald turned around and a shocked gasp escaped his quivering lips as his whole body shook. His bones rattled in the constant fear of the being that loomed before him. His heart was pounding so hard against his ribcage as his pulse pressed outward, jerking the veins within. Ronald couldn't believe his eyes. He didn't want to. He never saw something like that even in his worst nightmares. But that was only because his brain always woke him up before such a horrific image crossed his mind. And now Ronald was seeing something his eyes won't ever be able to erase. He didn't remember being that scared in his life. And that was just the beginning. A few minutes ago Josh had left the room. But for some reason Josh was here crawling towards him. His whiskey light brown hair prickled Ronald's skin as he positioned his upper body on Ronald's numb arms. His ghostly pale skin glimmered in the flickering lights above them and his blinding green eyes stared widely at Ronald. It was Josh, but at the same time it wasn't. His eyes were unblinking and there was something inhuman about him. Ronald sat frozen, wondering if he was dreaming. Ronald believed for a moment that the creature he saw before him was simply a ghost, and that if he placed his hands on him, it would go through. That would have comforted the boy, and let him know that the being in front of him is a hallucination. So Ronald stretched his tremoring arm outwards and placed it on Josh's shoulder. To his horrid surprise he felt skin. Real skin. It was soft and pudgy, he could tug at it, and it would bounce back to its natural form like an elastic. He began hyperventilating. Thoughts began accelerating inside his head. Ronald wants them to slow so he can breathe, but they won't. His breaths come in quick gasps and he almost blacks out. His heart is hammering inside his chest, as if it belongs to a rabbit running for its skin. The room spins and he supports his frail body by clutching on to the bench behind him. He tries to make everything slow to something his brain and body can cope with. Ronald attempted to swat the ghost away, but only the harsh slap of skin could be heard in the still as ice silence. Josh didn't even flinch. He continued staring at Ronald, wide-eyed with a lopsided grin on his face. His grin was too broad and his eyes were too large. It was like someone told this non-human creature to act as human as possible, and this uncanny behavior was the result of that. His eyes widened as the ghost Josh suddenly places his icy hands on Ronald's cheek. Then he twisted and pinched his skin violently, resulting in Ronald letting out agonizing whimpers. His palms were sweaty and the adrenaline coursing through his system was shutting down his ability to think logically. He wanted to run or beat the inhumanness out of him, either would do. However, the grip Josh had on Ronald's face forced him to stand still, because if he moved an inch, he knew the creature would have the strength to rip his skin. Suddenly Josh spoke. "What are you, Ronald?" he asked in a distorted and blaring voice. His voice was coarse like a fragmented rock in a Hessian sack, grinding against each other. Although in an eerie way, it complemented his ghastly complexion and raised veins. Ronald gulped as Josh leaned closer towards him. He crawled over his body and dug his long claws in his cheeks with so much force that Ronald felt a vein inside him pop. "I don't know," he yelled, trying to kick the ghost off of him. It was no use, as this Josh was clinging onto Ronald like a leech. With every fingernail that was piercing into his skin, Ronald felt his blood being sucked in by Josh. "What are you, Ronald?" He spat, with more ferocity this time. His grip around Ronald's chin tightened as the wrath of his words succumbed Ronald. Ronald watched with trembling fear as the whites in Josh's eyes turned a pure black, and his iris glowered with a jade-green light. Shapes, lines, and numbers formed in the iris, placed in a sort of manner that Ronald nearly recognized. His lethal stare felt painful, as if his glare was ripping Ronald's heart apart with a simple blinding jade-green light. "Dirty." The monster in front of him jeeringly grinned, satisfied with that answer. He slowly let go of Ronald and continued to creepily stare at him, his smiling eyes never averting its gaze. Ronald hesitated for a moment as he still felt Josh's lingering touch on him. He slowly picked himself up, realizing he was free from Josh's unsettling grasp. Ronald backed away, with a limp in his right leg. He kept his gaze on Josh, who was kneeling on the floor, a sinister smile fastened on his face. Then he fled. He turned around the corner and ran towards the door. This abrupt and swift movement from Ronald caused Josh to instinctively follow him. Josh trailed after him clumsily, his body wobbling weirdly from side to side, as it seemed this being was not used to running with human legs. The wide smile that reached his pointy ears never shifted, not even for a second. With each footfall, a jarring pain shoots from his ankle to knee. Ronald's heart beats frantically as he realized that it was all or nothing. Fail and his whole body will pay the price. Run and the damage is limited mostly to his shins and knees. His breath came in small spurts, hot and anxious. At his sides, his tan fingers curled into sweaty fists, swinging forward as if it would make him faster. Behind him, he could hear the baying howls of the ghost Josh that will haunt him forever. Blood smeared his bruised face as sweat dripped from his matted hair. "Please God, let me live," he cried aloud, throwing himself forward with even greater abandon. His lungs and heart were pumping, but the air didn't seem to be enough as he sprinted forward, panic trembling in his exhausted limbs. Ronald's hands trembled as he quickly pulled the door open and stepped outside, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The chilly air of the conditioned gym shocked Ronald's throat as he inhaled deeply. He slammed the door behind him and turned around to see that Josh had been caught between the door. The ghost disintegrated on the spot. Ronald's chest heaved heavily as he watched the smiling face of Josh disappear. Ronald didn't even waste time to bat an eyelash, as he swiftly limped towards freedom. He pushed the green doors of the gym open and finally arrived at the comfort of the crowded school hallways. As he slowly trudged towards the group, he swore to never take the comfort of people surrounding him for granted, because being alone with an incomprehensible creature is far worse. "So what happened?" Jimmy asked once everyone returned to their initial meeting spot, in the middle of an empty hallway. He stood next to Yuta and was tapping his foot eagerly. Yuta's gaze was cast on the ground, and he was lost in his own world. Ronald thought that was suspicious, but he didn't care enough to think deeply about it for too long. Right now, his legs were aching and the bones in his fists were poking at Ronald's skin uncomfortably. He desperately wanted to go to the nurse's office, but he had to tell Jimmy and the others what happened first. Carter peered strangely at Josh and Ronald, who stood far away from each other. "What happened to you two?" he asked, referring to both of the boys' bloody noses and beat-up faces. Carter suddenly gasped. "Did paranormal activity happen to both of you at the same time?" Josh huffed and crossed his blood-stained arms. "No paranormal activity happened at all. We just got in a fight," he muttered, staring at the ground. Ronald shivered as he looked at the real Josh. He couldn't erase the image of the ghost Josh he encountered. Looking at Josh scared him so much that he couldn't find the strength to debunk his statement. Carter raised a white-haired eyebrow. "Just a fight. Ronald's nose looks broken," he remarked. "You both made a knuckle sandwich out of each other." "Anyway, tell us what happened," Jimmy interjected, looking around the group. It was visible on Jimmy's childlike face that he was eager to know the results of his test. "Jessica and Olivia?" he asked, turning to look at the two girls for any new findings. Jessica shook her head. "Nothing happened to either of us," she answered, a grim look on her face. Ronald almost forgot that Jessica was technically still his girlfriend. He wondered if he should break up with her, now that she seems to be not involved with Olivia's squad anymore. It's not like it would break her heart, as Ronald noticed the closeness between her and Yuta. Next to her, Olivia stood still. Her eyes were cast on the ground and never looked up. Ronald noticed that there was a slight quivering of her limbs. Did her breakup with Josh mess her up this much? Ronald found it hard to believe, so he assumed there must be other things going on in her life. Jimmy nodded at Jessica's disappointing answer. Carter and Barbara? He asked, his hazel eyes full of hope. Carter and Barbara shook their heads. We both tried our best, but nothing happened. I suppose one can't force it, Carter said, shrugging. Josh and Ronald? Jimmy asked, turning to look at the boys. Josh shook his head and scoffed. Nothing. Your plan was shit, Jimmy, he scornfully remarked. Everyone immediately turned to look at Yuta, without hesitation. Ronald opened his mouth and tried to speak up, but his mouth was drooling with blood. He couldn't move his mouth without his tongue dipping in bitter blood, so he swiftly wiped his mouth with his shirt. There was a lot of blood, so it took some time. None of ya experienced anything. Jimmy murmured. I was here with Yuta the whole time and he didn't do anything. Neither did the school, from what you guys said. Olivia twirled her hair and spoke softly. A shadow was still cast over her drained eyes. If the school did nothing, we have no way of telling why. But Yuta did nothing because you were watching him, she said, referring to Jimmy's earlier hypothesis. Plus, he was too far away from everyone else now. Yuta shouted. I'm not the one. He sighed before continuing. So what if nothing happened to you? That could mean a lot of things. Don't just instantly suspect me. I did nothing, so that's good. I'm innocent. It could be the school's fault or... Yes, Ronald sputtered after he finally mustered the strength to speak. The entire group turned to look at him with perplexed faces. What do you mean, Ronald? Jimmy queried with a raised eyebrow. Yes. I experienced paranormal activity, Ronald said flatly. He swallowed the remaining droplets of blood and forced himself to calm his damaged nerves. Josh furrowed his eyebrows, baffled like everyone else. He's lying. I didn't see anything. It was after you left, he explained, wiping his bloody nose. I was alone and I couldn't move my body. Then a creature approached me. Felt so real. I could touch it and feel it. Ronald shivered at the memory and purposely avoided looking at Josh's face. He decided not to explain the details of his paranormal experience, because that would be admitting out loud that his fear is of losing to Josh. So that means only one of you experienced paranormal activity, Jimmy said, as he bit his lip and looked around the group. It's not Yuta. I swear I didn't see him do anything, not that it would matter. He sighed and ran his hand through his blonde hair. That means it's likely that the one is the school, and it can only make paranormal activity occur to one of you at a time. Yuta, Carter, and Jessica sighed with relief, now that the suspicions were lifted off of Yuta. Somewhat. However, Ronald still believed Yuta has something to do with it. Whether it was knowingly or unknowingly, to him Yuta had a role in this situation. Yuta was just too mysterious to not be a suspect. Why, you're right. Barbara muttered. But how can we be sure that it's the school? I know we recently tested it, but there's a high chance we could be wrong. We should think about only the facts we gained from this test. She spoke up, biting her lip nervously as she voiced her opinion. We now know that the thing occurs to each of us one at a time. It will most likely occur in a place or around people we have connections to. It usually happens when we're distracted or caught off guard. It happens on school days only, not during the weekend. It all started after the first day of school. I know there's a lot of correlations to either Yuta or the school, but we should be open to other possibilities, Barbara said, listing almost all of the facts they knew. Jessica smiled at Barbara and nodded her head. Barbara's right. Could be any student in this entire school. For example, someone who has a vendetta against us. Jessica bit her lip as a second thought entered her mind. By the way, Yuta doesn't hate any of you, so I suggest we should dismiss him as a suspect in general. Josh grunted, interrupting anyone else who wanted to combat Jessica's statement. Ryan, he mumbled. Ryan hates me. Ronald rolled his eyes, still feeling slightly pissed at Josh. Ryan doesn't hate you. You hate Ryan. Plus, he's too much of a moron to possess paranormal powers. Or whatever, he pointed out, shaking his head. Jimmy placed a palm over his forehead. Think logically. It has to be someone who knows us all. Don't just go around pointing fingers. Carter huffed, his arms crossed like a military commander. Says the one who claims Yuta, of all people, is the one, he muttered under his breath. Oh my gosh, Olivia abruptly gasped. Linda. It has to be her. She's such a flub. I swear to God if it is her, I'm going to kill her, Olivia stated, her voice less high-pitched than usual. This is going nowhere, Yuta commented, rolling his eyes at Olivia's stupidity. Ronald chuckled a little, realizing how ironic this conversation was. Nobody among the student population hates us as much as we hate each other, he pointed out. There was silence among the group, as they secretly agreed but were too proud to admit it out loud. Oh, Jimmy breathed, a light bulb turning on in his brain. Why are we only thinking about the students? Half the kids here don't know us individually and the other half are dolts, he said, looking around at their confused faces. Who else knows us better than our teachers? Everyone paused to think for a moment, and then suddenly a rush of excitement brought the teenagers' dull expression back to life. Their usual bleak and hopeless conversing finally led to something worth being happy for. It also seemed that they all agreed on the prospect of one of the teachers possibly being the one. Yes, Yuta chirped, jumping up. Carter grinned, appreciating that smart proposal. Damn, Jimmy. You're onto something here. All the teachers at Willesden suck and most of them hate the students, so it doesn't seem that far-fetched. He exclaimed, his white eyes brighter than the lights above them. Except for Mr. Stevenson, he's laid back and actually teaches. Anyways, we all at least had one class with every teacher here since there are so few. They all know us well, Josh remarked. Jessica clapped her hands, excited that they were making a lot of progress. So, who are our teacher suspects? And should we test them too? She asked ecstatically. Of course. I'll think of something tonight. Any suggestions for the teachers? Jimmy asked, proud of the praises he was getting. Ronald thought for a moment. McGurty, he simply stated. I understand her being tough on the football team since she's our coach, but she's even tough on her students. You all had her at least once this year or last, right? Olivia nodded as she ran her fingers through her curly dark brown hair. Yeah. She seriously started yelling at me for wearing heels in gym class last year, she said, rolling her eyes ignorantly. Josh scoffed at Ronald. McGurty. Seriously, Ronald. She's the best teacher, second only to Stevenson, Josh remarked. Ronald wasn't sure whether or not he was being serious. Plus, why would she purposely want to hurt me? I'm her star player. Ronald rolled his eyes. Whatever you say, palm greaser. Ronald decided not to respond with too much of a harsh comeback. There was still tension between the two, but he truly wanted this pain to be over with. He just wanted to move on. Jimmy placed his hands on his hips as he pondered. McGurty is officially on the suspects list. She's mean and treats every student harshly, but it could be simply because she's McGurty. It's not hard to imagine McGurty purposely wanting to harm students. Purposely wanting to harm students? Olivia questioned, arching her eyebrows. I know a teacher whose purpose in life is to harm students. Carter peered at Olivia curiously. Who? Mrs. Briggs. She's literally a witch, she stated, crossing her arms proudly. The entire group widened their eyes with realization and said, oh. In unison. Every student at Willesden encountered Mrs. Briggs, and it always went south. Jimmy nodded his head. Good, we have a few more suspects. Tomorrow we'll test them all. By the way, y'all should think deeply about what your fears are, okay? Be prepared to tell them tomorrow, because I need to confirm whether or not this theory is true. Everyone nodded before parting ways. Today was solemn for them, but to Ronald, it left him heavy-hearted. He took one last glance at Josh and whispered goodbye to his childhood friend.